can query the data that's stored in your Dataverse instance. So we've got some tools out of the box, but then there's some limitations to those. So let's see how we can extend that, taking it with some extra technology outside of Dataverse as well, and then just trying to sort of pick the right tool for the right job. So we've got sort of a lot of pros and cons for all different versions. If you want to move on, Matt. So just a quick intro to us. So I'm Mark Carrington. I'm the Chief Technologist at Data8. Got my Twitter on there. And then with me is Matt, one of my colleagues. We've both recently awarded MVP status earlier this year. So very pleased about that. But don't want to spend too long on us and dig into what we're actually going to be talking about.
So I'll go for it for now. That's okay. So so the joy of it is we've worked together for 10 years, so there's probably going to be a bit more flip-flopping and discussion points than other people get, because we generally know where we're going with one another. So the perks of working with people for a longer time. So the purpose of the session today, and I know it's a developer track, but we've gone in with this idea of no knowledge and tell the story and get deeper and deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole to get more and more complex as it goes on. So if you're at the start and you're a seasoned developer and you think, I know how to do these things, bear with us. We do get into the more deeper things. We're just trying to keep everybody satisfied, and hopefully someone takes something at some point. And what we're trying to do in the story we're trying to tell for this next hour or 55 minutes is the simple things you can do, the middle ground things you can do with low code. Then you can start introducing a bit of code, and then you can then start looking at the more complex stuff that Microsoft do offer. So we're just going to sort of pick it apart bit by bit and see what's going on in all these things. So ultimately, the ultimate thing we're trying to talk about today and we're trying to discuss is how can we query our data that lives within Dataverse. We can't just log into a SQL server and do update statements like we can in the old days. Not that you ever should have done those things, but those things were there and they could be done. So with a cloud-based infrastructure, there is more decisions that have to be made. So the very simple thing, and that exists nowadays, is quick find. It's simple as that. You go on and you have a little search on the right-hand side of a model-driven app in this case, and you would do a search and your data is there. Layer on top of that, advanced find. So already you're getting a little bit more complex. So your advanced find, you have a little UI and you get some results. And with that UI, you can make a criteria. You can essentially do your joins up and down tables. And you can also determine what you're getting returned in your results. So you've already got a level of extra things you can do there. More recently, relevant search. Relevant search is a relatively new thing, I would say 12, 18 months, I think, maybe. To the point where it's so new that it's turned off by default right now. I think in older environments, it is on in a newer environment, and I think at some point will be enforced on in possibly the next wave. I'm not sure on the exact dates on those, but you will start seeing it as time goes on those things. Yes, Philip, that's a good comment. Opening advanced find and make a cup of tea whilst it opens. In their defense, that has got better in the last few months, I would say. I mean, 6 months ago, I would agree it was terrible. I used to open 3 tabs and play in internal games of which one of those 3 tabs would win that race, even though they all would render at the same time. And by turning that on, you get a little search bar at the top. So it's very, very similar to quick find in the fact that there is a single box you type into and you can configure where that's searching and what that's searching for, but the results you get are a little bit more complex. So that's going to be searching globally. So in this case, again, you just see an example of account, but you can configure this to go across your accounts and your contacts and your leads and your wider picture of the full data set. And as well as having the data there, I mean, that's great for seeing lists, but sometimes you want aggregate data. Sometimes you want to see charts and statistics and whatever you're doing there. So there is the out-of-the-box charts. You press the little show chart button and you get a little, normally blue at this point, chart of all these things that you're wanting to see. And then just as I was writing this slide deck, Microsoft decided to ghost release a new feature that is pretty much brand new at this point, which is in preview. And it's so in preview that right now, whilst it is rolling out, it wasn't in my region for me to enable and get some actual real screenshots of it. So that's how new it is. I think it's rolling out. It's in Canada and a few others right now. So there is the link in there. If I click on the link, if I just bang out of that a minute and jump into there, you can see here that this is what it is. Ultimately, you get a little visualize this view button there, and it will ping up a Power BI dashboard and get a lot more in-depth data in there. This is brand new. This is in preview. This is this is subject to change. Don't put it into production, but it's very interesting to see that it's a direction they're going. I think the Power BI usage within model driven has always been a little bit limited, so that's a very interesting thing that they've just put in there. That's great, right? That's the sort of the standard few things in there. Oh yeah, advanced lookup. Do you know what? Advanced lookup is one that I didn't see, and again, that's another one that I believe right now, thanks for that Bippin, is a feature that you have to enable to turn on. It's probably going to be enforced at some point, but be a little while before those things are enforced. So that's great for standard querying, but there's problems, and the system hasn't, in my opinion, moved with the times. What used to work in Dynamics 2011, 2013 is still very much the same right now as is always there. So if I go into accounts, for example, and I can do my show chart and I can see the chart there, and I've got a chart. In fact, no, I want to contact. I'll just give you spoilers where I'm going there. So I go to contacts and show you my charts, and I pick a chart, and I've got a chart there, and that works, and that renders, and that does all its thing. And this has been here for a long time. If I go into accounts and show a similar sort of chart, I just get a very, very unhelpful error. This is actually, again, this is in my opinion, this is one of a few areas where when unified interface got introduced, it actually caused a regression in certain areas, because as a dev, I understand the stack trace, I understand exceptions, and I can sort of see where things are going. Whereas unified interface actually hid a lot of those things. Stuff like download log file got harder to find in those areas. So what I have to start doing at this point, because I get very curious, I start digging into these areas and I start looking at my developer tools and seeing what we've got and we eventually find somewhere in a request a response. Is it going to be in this one? No, that's in the data. I can't even find where it's going to be now. And there you go. You get a response, and when you dig into the response code, you sort of start to see errors mentioned around aggregate limit exceeded. And the truth of it is if you didn't know that, what that means is that any count over 50,000 FetchXML, which is ultimately the code behind the scenes that's running all these queries, starts bombing out at 50,000 and then really starts to struggle. And I think that is what I was saying about how it hasn't got with the times, because there is a heavy reliance still on FetchXML in a lot of the things that they do. Those restrictions that you have ultimately can never be worked around. So it's going to be new features that they need to introduce, and that's where things like the Power BI dashboard comes into play, because what that is actually doing behind the scenes is that's going to convert to SQL and do some other stuff in other areas that Mark will get onto shortly. Now, there is other options that we've seen people use before, and I will talk about them all there. I don't necessarily recommend them. That there is perks and there's negatives to each one. So let's say I wanted to analyze those those 50,000 plus accounts. I could export it into Excel. Now, fine, I know you can do that, but I mean, you've then got an Excel spreadsheet, all your accounts, it's then offline. God knows where that's going. Anyone with any DLPs in place or any restrictive rights on those things, which I think a lot of people have got nowadays, means that realistically isn't a viable option. So it's an option that's there, and I think again, it used to work years ago when there wasn't much better things available, but I think there is better technology held back by a user interface at this point. This advanced find window is, again, it's one of the few things that has never had an update in, I can't even remember when. It's still 10 years into using Dynamics, I still find counterintuitive. Even navigating through these save views and sharing save views is still something that I have to think about every single time. If you've ever played with the Dynamics 365 apps and some of the newer ones, so I think the marketing app and a few others, they have a similar advanced find using sort of Fluent UI. So I'm hoping one day we see those areas on a refresh of these. That's absolutely pure speculation on my part, but it makes sense with where they would go with everything else they've done. And hopefully with those things, there might some restrictions might be lifted, but who knows? We will see, right? FetchXML is a tool which is behind this. So if I was to get a save view and I was to do that, I can now download that FetchXML, and that gives me some FetchXML behind the scenes, because no one likes to build FetchXML from scratch. FetchXML is actually more powerful than the user interface lets it be. I have no way, for example, on here of that technically isn't in a join. I would like to make that an hour to join, for example, but the UI gives me no way of doing that. So this is a nice easy example of any accounts that have a contact where the status is active. That's what that's going to show me. But if there is certain criteria you may want to do that the unified interface and this screen here will simply not let you do. So an example of that is often when you have to use do not. So please show me any accounts that do not have an active phone call, for example. That can be rendered in FetchXML within the XML, but this UI is then going to bomb out and say you can't do it. So what you can do is you've got FetchXML Builder. When you're logged into your org, you can open views that are already in your system. It will then pre-populate it with the closest tab that you've got. But then you can then make these changes in here. So you could actually add more criteria. So a simple answer here is I'm now going to change that join from an inner to an outer. And then you can then save that and you can push that save back in as the save view. So you can make these changes and you can get around the limits of the user interface and you can give FetchXML more power. However, you still do have this ultimate restriction on things like aggregation and user interfaces. So using anything within a model-driven app, I think, is a very simple way to broaden it. Is very small groups of data. Realistically, you want to be looking at 250 max, and the reason you're doing your 250 max is because when you go into your personalization settings and you can set that to be your 250, as soon as you start going above those and you're looking at pagination or those things, anything look at data that way for me personally becomes harder, and I need to look at elsewhere in the system. Which at this point, I think, Mark, if I can hand over to you, then you can go into a bit more detail of some other stuff.
Thanks, Matt. Let me just get this presenting.
Yeah, I've got it.
Okay. So yeah, so FetchXML is kind of the main language of Dataverse data querying, and yes, it's more powerful than the user interface lets on, and you can kind of see that power using tools like FetchXML Builder. But there are more options if we dig in a bit deeper. So let's start off with have a look at what Dataverse is really made up of and what that FetchXML is querying. So Dataverse under the covers is behind the scenes as a SQL database, and that's how dynamic CRM was for a decade or more. You send a FetchXML query to Dataverse, to the platform, and that gets translated to a SQL query, gets you your results and passes them back again. But over the last few years, for Dataverse in the online environments, it's actually expanded into a richer way of storing data than just SQL. So where you're storing file attachments, things like that, SQL is not a very efficient way of storing that data, especially in terms of cost. So that was split out. So any sort of file attachment information, a few other tables are actually stored in Azure Blob Storage. And you can see this in your in the Power Platform Admin Center. You can see the capacity limits of your database storage, which is your SQL database, and your file storage, where all your email attachments and the like go. And there's also a Cosmos DB database behind the scenes for things like the audit trail history. And in fact, you can extend this even further to say, also, I've got some virtual entities which might call out to an API. And those are all exposed as standard Dataverse entities, but you're completely different storage, maybe even no storage at all, could all be just completely dynamically generated. And if you send a FetchXML query to Dataverse, that will pick up what entity type you're querying and route it to the appropriate storage mechanism and translate it to a SQL query or the set of API calls that it needs to make. But by and large, the data that you want to query sort of 95% of the time is probably going to be in that SQL database. And SQL is just massively more powerful than FetchXML. The great thing about FetchXML is because it is limited, it can be easily translated into all these different types. Whereas if you try and take an arbitrary SQL statement and say, right, I want to query my virtual entity provider with all sorts of subqueries and applies and all the more sort of esoteric aspects of SQL language, it's just going to be kind of impossible to translate that into something that a regular API can handle. But where we are talking to SQL, then we do want to be able to make some more use of that. And if you're coming from an on-prem world where you've been maybe making some SSRS reports and things like that, which can leverage that full power of SQL, you might find that suddenly having to be restricted down to the power of FetchXML is kind of limiting. So in the last, year and a half, 2 years or so, Microsoft introduced this thing called the TDS endpoint, TDS being the protocol that SQL Server uses under the covers. So this is designed to be used from Power BI to generate those more complex reports, and from SQL Server Management Studio in order to just execute arbitrary queries. So again, this is a feature that's turned off by default for older environments, on by default for new ones. So if you are on an existing environment, don't have this turned on already, you can go into the Power Platform Admin Center and go and turn that on under the features of your environment. And this gets us just access to this one part of Dataverse. So it doesn't give you all your Dataverse data, but I say probably 95% of your Dataverse data, your standard line of business data, your accounts, your contacts, etc. They're all going to be in there. So we can have a look at how that actually works. So if we start off with Power BI and have a look at this same data set that Matt was showing us before. So in Power BI, I can set up a chart here. I'm just going to sort of have a little investigate around that contact data that Matt was showing us. So I can do get data, and within that, if that starts to load anytime soon, there we go, under Power Platform. We can ignore the legacy one here, go with Dataverse. In there, we can just put in the URL of our environment. And I can see I've got my Summit demo one there. And you can just sort of pick and choose which of these tables that you want to be able to pull your data from. So at the moment, I've just pulled in the contact one. And then you've got all the power of Power BI from there, really. So you can choose to do this in direct query mode or import mode. So those are the two standard options that Power BI gives you. Direct query mode is what we're using here. Now this means that anytime you load this report, rather than Power BI having a copy of data, it passes that query to that TDS endpoint, which ultimately maps it down to the underlying SQL database. And this is great because it understands who is making the request, and it can apply all those same security rights that Dataverse does for us normally. So people can only see the contacts that they can access, etc. So depending on who actually opens the report, they will see, first of all, absolutely live data because it is querying Dataverse live. And second of all, it's going to apply their security roles so that they can only see the records that they would be able to see through a regular model-driven app, for example. So here we can see just a simple chart of how common each first name is, just a simple demo. I can leverage the power of some of the Power BI visualizations, make it a bit nicer. I can maybe say how popular is each first character of those names, and I can see names beginning with A are more popular than names beginning with W, for example, which is all great. And you can take this a lot further than I have here with a much more complex report, but it's always pulling that data live and with the security roles direct from Dataverse. You can also use it in import mode where it takes a copy of that data. That gives you more options for how you can manipulate that data within Power BI because it's not always limited to things that can be translated back to SQL. but you do lose the liveness and the Dataverse security permissions on top of that. So we can do it from Power BI. And I think this is what the TDS endpoint was really originally invented for, to give you these extra reporting options. And Matt showed where that's going in future, hopefully as maybe as a replacement for the inbuilt charts that say was possibly a step backwards in the unified interface, trying to bring that up to a much more modern standard and make all that much more interactive and remove some of these limitations of 50,000 records that we get through FetchXML. But we can also do it through SQL Server Management Studio, and here we can just write some arbitrary queries. We can investigate our data a bit more dynamically. And we can do that just as if it was any other SQL database. So if I start up SQL Server Management Studio, what a lot of people will try to do, and I haven't got to work so far, is to use the Azure Data Studio, which is the Visual Studio Code-based interface. That seems to have some problems connecting to it, so I would use SQL Server Management Studio, at least for the moment. So to connect to it through here, again, all we need is that the domain name from your organization URL. You need to pick the Azure Active Directory authentication type. If you're not using MFA, you can use just the password option. But hopefully you've got MFA enabled, you can use that. And you'll get the standard login screen pop up. Get the MFA prompt. And hopefully that should let me in. Come on, authenticator.
If that fails, click it and get your code. I just find that's easier.
Okay, I was trying to do it through my watch. It doesn't seem to like the integration to my watch anymore.
Yes.
So in here, we'll now see just that one database. You'll notice that it's read-only. So this is for querying for reports. This does not let you do updates, inserts, deletes, etc. But it does let us use almost any select statement. There are some restrictions that Dataverse imposes on that. This is not going directly to that underlying SQL database. It's a very good impersonation of it, but it is going through an extra layer on top of that to make sure that it's applying all the right security rules, things like that. But it's also restricting some of the SQL language that you can do. I think partly for sort of security permissions, this is going to a shared SQL database, that a shared SQL server, I should say, that other instances might be on, stopping you doing any sort of system level queries. But for, again, the vast majority of your select statements, you should be absolutely fine. And we can have a little explore around in here, and we can see the tables that we got. So every sort of standard entity type will show up in here as a table, and we can have a look inside, for example, the account table. We can have a look at what columns that's got. And you can see that's all come through with all the right data types and everything. So I can repeat that same query that we've got in Power BI there. If I create a new query here, and I can do something like see how popular different letters of the first name are. And so hopefully here we've got some results that match the Power BI query. So we've got A, M, C being the most popular first letters, which matches up with what we've got here. And we can take this much further. Obviously, you can do all your joins to different tables. You can do aggregates. You can do filters. You can do sorts. If we try and do what Matt was trying to do before, again, having an aggregate on the accounts, which doesn't work under FetchXML, we can have a look at that. And that will work just fine through the TDS endpoint, where it doesn't work through FetchXML. because it doesn't have this 50,000 record limit. There are some limits in place here, again, to stop you overloading the system in various ways. It's subject to the same 2-minute timeout as any plugin execution. So if you've got some really complex queries on some big data sets, you might find you get some timeout errors at 2 minutes. And there's also a limit of, I think, about 84 megabytes of response data set size. So again, you can't use this to just stream all your columns of millions and millions of rows, because you'll hit that error instead. But say for kind of ad hoc queries, for reports where you're doing aggregations, you're getting the top records, it should fill all those needs. So Biffin, yes, you can use C# to go and connect to this. You can use the standard SQL client. Again, I believe the at least was a problem early days about connecting with the Microsoft SQL client rather than the system SQL client. I'm not sure whether that's now being resolved, but certainly with the system.data.sql client library, you can connect in with that. It's not documented as being supported. The only GA way of using this endpoint is through Power BI. You connecting to it through SQL Server Management Studio is in preview, I still think. And connecting to it through C# is not documented at all, but in my experience has worked just fine. I believe that's actually what SQL Server Management Studio uses behind the scenes itself anyway. Okay, so the next option I wanted to show was an XRM Toolbox tool, SQL for CDS. So this is a tool that I've developed over the last few years, before the TDS endpoint was around. So this is, even without the TDS endpoint being enabled, you can go and write queries in standard SQL syntax here. So let me just do the same one again. I can run that same query in here and get those same results. But behind the scenes, that's actually translated this to a FetchXML query. So you can't do that query directly in FetchXML. So all this has done here is it's gone to get the first name of all the contacts, and then it's processed it through some extra steps to go and do that aggregation. It will try and convert it as much to FetchXML as possible. So it's another alternative if you need to build a FetchXML query, but you're actually more comfortable writing SQL syntax, you can go and write it in SQL and use this tool to convert it. So if you wanted to get some account and contact details, for example, you can build some joins in here. So look at getting the name of the accounts and their related primary contacts. We can go and get that, apart from I didn't put those aliases in, so that's not going to work. So in here you can see that's translated that entire thing directly to FetchXML. And you can go and use that if you're trying to build up queries that you need to use in other integrations, in plugins. You can use this tool to go and generate those FetchXML queries. I mentioned that the TDS endpoint was read-only as well, but in this tool we can use it for updates, inserts, deletes as well. So we could do we can set some email address here. I don't know if I'm actually in. Didn't find me, so I can insert me instead. So I can add that contact. I can then go and update it to set its email address. And then I can pull that data back out again. So behind the scenes, this is using all your standard Dynamics API. So it's not doing anything naughty behind the scenes, doing undocumented updates directly to the SQL database or anything. This is all going through your the standard API. So it's triggering any plugins or anything like that that would normally happen when you update, insert records. It's, I think, probably as efficient as it's possible to be to get it to run the queries that aren't natively supported by FetchXML. What I mean by that is, if you try to run this query here, it will run it, but it's got to do a lot of heavy lifting itself. It's not SQL Server. It's trying to do a lot of stuff in memory here. So don't try and do things on millions and millions of records with this, because it's not going to work very well. But it's quite happy doing things on a few thousands, 100,000 records. Should be absolutely fine. And for sort of data patching, doing little changes where it's much easier to write an update statement to go and fix some records than it is to go through and do sort of bulk edit within the UI. Could be a useful tool for you there. So this is all working within the data that's actually in Dataverse. It's working on it live. It's all that sort of absolute sort of transactional data. But for doing bigger reporting, for doing analysis, if you want to get into machine learning, anything like that, it's not a very good idea to be doing that on your live data. You'll be maybe causing timeouts for other users. You'll be hitting performance problems yourself trying to use that data. So we get to the point where we really need to take the data out of Dataverse, take a copy of it, and work with it elsewhere. And ideally, we want to keep that copy up to date. So we can take a one-off copy, you can do some extracts to Excel or whatever, but they're very static. It doesn't scale very well. So there are two systems that Microsoft come up with over time. The first was the data export service. This was or is an add-on solution that I think you get from AppSource, where you set up an Azure SQL database. You can configure this data export service solution to tell it what entities you want it to sync across. And then it'll quite cleverly go and create the tables in your Azure SQL database and sync across your data as records are created, updated, deleted in Dataverse. That will be replicated across to your Azure SQL database. And then you can use that as you like from there. And this kind of made things a lot easier for people coming from the on-prem world, where they were used to being able to talk to that back-end SQL database to do reporting and stuff against. And you can still go and get that. That still works today, but what you will see being pushed a lot more is it started off as export to data lake and is now labeled export to Azure Synapse. So data lake is it's an Azure service where you can store just ridiculous amounts of data from different sources, and then you try and pull that together and query it in lots of different ways. And it's a lot more amenable to just huge amounts of data, more so than the Azure SQL database option is. Again, it's a ongoing replica, so it's not a snapshot. It does keep taking data over time. As your Dataverse data changes, it will update that in Data Lake. And there's been a few more options in the Data Lake version than the SQL version. So you can do things like, if a record is deleted in Dataverse, you can choose to have that deleted from the data lake, but you can also choose to have it just flagged as being deleted, so you can do historical reporting much more easily. So I'm going to jump into how we set that up now. So in the Maker portal under Dataverse, you'll see this Azure Synapse link. So it was export to data lake. It's now Azure Synapse link, but I'll get into what that really means behind the scenes. So within this link here, we can see two things. We can see how that data is exported to the data lake behind the scenes. I'll get that loading. And we can also go and query that in the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. Get that loading as well. So the data is initially exported to this storage account. Now, a data lake is just a specialized version of Azure storage account, which is massively cheaper than any of the Dataverse storage options. So it's a good option to have a look at if you want to keep historical data for much longer than you can really afford to keep it within Dataverse. And we can poke around in here. We can have a look under in the blob containers. You can actually sort of see what it's doing behind the scenes here. You can see it's created as a container here, which has got a lot of files in. So it's got some JSON files to try and describe the metadata that's in there. It's got some CSV files with the actual data in, and this sort of goes into different snapshots of the data over time. And these are updated on a pretty much continual basis. It's not live to the sense that the TDS endpoint is live, but it's pretty close to it. So I think there is a soft SLA of about 15 minutes latency. So if you create a record in Dataverse, it should show up in your data lake copy within 15 minutes. Practically, we've seen that be more like tens of seconds in real world usage. And then we also have an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, which lets us query that. So this is not a nice format to query. So this is in common data model format, which is nice and interchangeable. There are lots of different systems which can go and use this. And once your data is in the data lake, there's lots of different tools you can use to go and pull out data and work with it in all sorts of different ways. But the one that kind of gives you very quick access to just start doing queries on it is the Synapse Analytics workspace. So in here, again, we can see that database, we can go and see the tables, and now we can just see the tables that we've chosen to sync across. This is completely up to you which tables you choose to sync. In this case, we've just picked 3 that we're interested in, but you can go and pick as many as you want of these. Then from here, we can go and query it. So you can use SQL scripts, you can use Apache Spark. I'm going to go SQL again, just because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. And again, I can write this exact same query again. In fact, I'm just going to copy and paste it across from SQL for CDS. Now, this is using what's called a serverless pool. So behind the scenes here, there is no big SQL Server resource that I'm paying for on an ongoing basis. All that I'm really paying for is the data lake storage, which is pence per gigabyte. It's practically nothing. But I can still query this with the full power of a SQL Server data warehouse. It's possibly not as fast as it would be because it's going to have to go and load in those CSV files on the fly, but it can process massive amounts. Again, here we're hardly stretching it by processing a few thousand records. This is designed to scale to millions of records and process complex machine learning jobs and things like this. So this is just a flavor of how you can easily get that data synced and start querying it. And again, you can query this through other tools as well. So I can connect to this through a SQL endpoint as well. So here I can connect to my, there's a SQL Server endpoint linked to that same Azure Analytics database. I'm not going to try and use my watch this time. And I can connect to it through here as well, and I can see that database and those same tables again, and I can start running queries. Okay, there we are. So yes, so for the sync, it's you can pick which entities you want, but within those entities, it's the entire thing. It's every row, it's every column. And then you can restrict that down as you're querying it, but all the data is there. But I mentioned that this is one way of querying it. Once that data is in the data lake, there's all sorts of extra options that you can do as well. And some of them are highlighted here. That's where I need to go to find it. Click on that. Okay. So in here, you get an idea of some of the other ways that you can use that data. So you can hook it up to Databricks, for example, and start running your machine learning jobs on it. You can hook that up to Power BI. So your Power BI is pulling data from the data lake rather than directly from that TDS endpoint. And again, you can use that to then combine that data with data from other sources. So you can sync in data from maybe an on-prem ERP system or a marketing automation system where you've got these different islands of data and you can bring them all together and start analyzing them together to get this more rounded view of your customers. You can use Azure Data Factory to pull extracts that data out and push them into other systems and manipulate it in various different ways. So really, once your data is in the data lake through this system, really the world is your oyster, quite how far you take the analysis, the reporting, the integration of that data. I think that is really the core of the different options we wanted to show. I want to kind of leave it with a comparison of some of the different options that we've talked about here. So Matt started us off with a view of some of the out-of-the-box tools we've got. So with things like Quick Find, Advanced Find, taking that a step further to look at the FetchXML that those use behind the scenes, what options that gives us. We've got the SQL for CDS tool in XRM Toolbox. We've got the TDS endpoint, and then we've got finally exporting the data to Data Lake and querying that with Synapse Analytics. So all of them can do any old query that you want. For more complex queries, we're probably maybe stepping away from out-of-the-box querying options. We can do some amount of more complex queries with FetchXML, but to really do much more complex ones, then we need something that can support a richer query language like SQL. They can all do aggregates to some extent, but anything that's based on FetchXML is going to have that limit of 50,000 records. And that is 50,000 records was the source records that you are aggregating. So after you apply any filters, even if you're just wanting a simple count that's going to give you one row back, which is your count, if there are more than 50,000 records to count, then that's not going to work, and we need to look at something else. Metadata is quite an interesting one, ways to be able to actually query metadata. There's no sort of standard way of doing that. It is something that SQL for CDS supports by exposing a different Dataverse API, which is the metadata querying APIs. That exposes it as any other data set, whereas the other ones are all about your actual data entities. I mentioned about how Dataverse has got lots of different data storage options behind the scenes there, and it can route your query to the right data storage option depending on the entity that you're querying. So any of these ones that are based on FetchXML can query all of those, but things like the TDS endpoint can only query the ones that are actually in the SQL database that your query ends up at. And the export to data lake can only query ones with entities with change tracking enabled, which tends to be those ones with a SQL backend as well. For absolutely live transactional data, So if someone adds a new opportunity in and you need your report to show it instantly, then you've got to be querying Dataverse directly. So that would exclude an export to data lake scenario. And similarly, if you want your users to be able to execute queries and only see the records that their Dataverse security roles give them, then again, you've got to be querying it in a way that is actually hitting Dataverse rather than an external copy of it. You might be able to replicate those security roles, and I'd have a look into doing that if you've got big data and complex queries, which might be hitting other problems with querying Dataverse directly. But certainly, if it's smaller data or queries that can execute pretty quickly, then it's simpler and probably safer to be doing that against Dataverse, and you can know that those security roles are going to be applied properly. As soon as we get into properly big data, so either just massive amounts of Dataverse data or wanting to integrate it with other data sources, then really your only option is to go for an external one like Synapse Analytics. And finally, if you're wanting to do this as an automated process, something where you're querying your data from external sources, from a custom application, for example, then you can use FetchXML queries. You can use TDS Endpoint unsupported. I think I mentioned that it works with the standard C# connector class, but it's not something that's documented as being supported. Or you can do something external. And I believe that's about it. Unless we've got any other questions, let's go through the.
No, that's it. To be honest, I've tried to answer the questions as we're going. For
Okay.
benefits of people that aren't reading chat, it's worth mentioning. So I guess the common question we had from a few people was restricting what you can sync with export to Data Lake or Azure Synapse or whatever it's called this week. Table by table, yes, you can filter those things, but then you can't go further than that. It's basically all or nothing. The only other option you've got is that I think you can set it so it doesn't delete, so it won't. If you delete a record within Dataverse, it won't delete that record within your Synapse, so it will still exist on there. So you've got idea of delete histories. That's pretty much the only thing that you've got that's configurable at this point.
So we can see that option here. So we've got this append only option. So whenever a record gets deleted, if append only was yes, then the record would be updated essentially in the data lake to say it's been deleted. Whereas with this set to no, which is the default, you get it. Any updates, any deletes, whatever, are just synced directly, and the record gets updated, deleted in data lake as well.
Yeah. There is things with Data Lake. I mean, it's when we've been looking at it, there is things in Data Lake that are there that aren't intuitively there. So things like option set values or the text equivalent. It's difficult to find them, but there is Microsoft Docs on how to do them, but there is more hoops to jump through than I think any of us would like to do compared to what we've been given in the past and compared to how easy things like SQL CDS has made it. But I think it's worth the export data is the thing, right? This isn't going nowhere. This is the future of the product of external syncing officially from Microsoft. So if you are, there is restrictions. Tell Microsoft that they will listen to it. There is investment going into those areas. So yes, it's a safe area to use. It isn't going nowhere, but there is its limitations right now.
Yeah, to give an idea of what that metadata looks like. So if we have a look at behind the scenes in the data lake, what this data looks like. So we've got CSV files here with the data for accounts. All the metadata is in this common data model JSON format. So if with the right tooling, then or some complex querying, then yes, you can get it out. But what you can't do is just say, select star from attributes. Then that's not it. That's not there. If you can parse this JSON format out and saying it is a standard format, this common data model, so there's lots of different tooling does support it, then you can access it, but it's just not as readily accessible as the actual underlying data is without that tooling.
Yeah.
Data export service versus data lake. Do you want to talk about that, Matt?
I mean, it's like 5 minutes, so we'll see what we get on. I'll try and answer it as quick as I can. So I mean, Data Export Service has been around for a while. For me, it's never been that massively reliable. There is problems with it with regards to its syncing sometimes. So because it's a database rather than a sort of a serverless data set, there is problems with the so things like the metadata, for example. If you're changing metadata in your Dataverse system, those changes don't roll up to the data export database that you're running. So I mean, data export is there. It works if people have got it going. It's not going anywhere. If you are moving forward with a decision on something about these areas, I would always go down the data lake option at this point, even knowing the restrictions, which actually subtly also answer Philip's question about translation support and multi-language environments, which again is the same problem. Export data lake takes your raw values. So if you've got different language codes and if you've got different translations, then you're only getting the raw data of everything that you're getting. And those tables, string map is what they call it. If you look at SQL CDS can query that table. It's a fascinating table that people don't really dig into, which stores any text equivalent of anything else. Those things do not sync to export to data lake. So that is where there is difficulties in doing it. Now, they do offer options to get that data in, but you've got to jump through hoops to make it work. So it depends on your use case, depends what you're getting it for, but I mean, data lake is the new trendy thing that I would suggest using at this point.
Yeah, so to give an example here, accessing that metadata for the translation. So if you've got an option set value, a choice column, what you will get by default is the underlying number value when you query that from data lake. In that metadata JSON file, those translations are there, but you've got to do the work with queries like this to actually get those values back out and join them back together. So the onus is on you rather than just selecting out the name version of the column like you can do with TDS Endpoint. That makes it very easy, and that gives you the localized version for the user that's running the query, so you immediately get that translation because it understands who's running the query. Whereas as soon as you're doing it external, that work is all on you to go and figure that out and do that the right way.
It makes you take Dataverse for granted and the model-driven apps for granted, if I'm totally honest, once you start digging into those areas. There's a question about checking data lake sync failure records. I can't answer that because I genuinely have never seen it. I've never seen it fail. As far as I'm concerned, all it's doing is dumping out to a CSV, so there isn't data integrity in there. It hasn't got all those things that a database can throw an exception on a unique key or a missing lookup. It's literally dumping raw data out in a serverless fashion. So its ability to fail, I guess, is a lot more limited.
Yeah, I think
maybe there is going to be some.
You've changed the config of the data lake and there's no permissions there anymore or something like that, maybe. But I'm not sure where it would write out the error to at that point.
No, but yeah. So I mean, it'd be interesting to see. I'd be very curious to see what it can fail on. There is going to be errors. I mean, like Carsten shared a screenshot there that you can do the filter on it there, but I'd be very interested to see what the errors are, to be totally honest, because in all the times we've been playing with it, we've never seen one. Whereas within an hour or two with data export service, I generally used to see them.
Yes, there's quite a lot of scope there because it is writing into a SQL database. Then you can be waiting on locks. You can go and change the metadata from underneath it by changing the column types. It's your database to mess around with then as you see fit. But the data export service has still got to try and write to it. So if you change it in a way that it can't write to it anymore, then it's going to start hitting some errors.
Well, thank you both, Mark and Matt. And again, thank you for developing the XRM Toolbox tool. I think that's highly, highly valuable. It's clearly in the matrix you're showing there. It's offering a lot more feature and capabilities that's going to help a lot of the developers solve their query challenges. So I just want to really, really thank you once again, Mark and Matt. And for those who don't already use the XRM Toolbox tool, Please ensure you support support the XRM Toolbox tool, as well as options for supporting the authors as well, for all the efforts that they do to maintain this tool. I know Mark is working effortlessly to really keep that tool up to date and constantly updating it. So once again, thank you both for that. Great tag team session there. By the way, whereabouts are you joining us from today?
We're both near Chester.
Chester, awesome, fantastic. Well, thank you again. Thanks for joining us from Chester today. And it's a great transition to the next session, which is on debugging Dataverse with Fiddler. So once again, thank you, Mark and Matt from Data8, based in Chester in the UK. Also check out the XRM Toolbox tools, and I'm sure we will see them soon at an event. So, okay,